At 10:15 on June 6, 1944, a field telephone rang inside a stone chateau overlooking the Seine at La Roche-Guyon, northwest of Paris. The headquarters belonged to Army Group B, and its commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was not there. Rommel was 52 years old. He was in Germany, several hundred kilometers away, moving between appointments and family obligations. His staff officers were already staring at the first coherent reports from Normandy: airborne landings behind the coast, naval gunfire off the beaches, and Allied fighters roaming the sky at low altitude. The danger wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a schedule. At 10:22, Rommel's chief of staff, Hans Speidel, began ordering liaison officers onto motorcycles and into staff cars. The roads between Paris and Normandy were about to become a killing ground. Allied aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons, were hunting anything that moved in daylight. In Rommel's world, that air threat was not a supporting detail. It was the central fact of modern war. Rommel's plan for Normandy had been built around that fact. He believed the decisive fight had to happen at the waterline, within the first hours, before the Allies could unload enough men, trucks, artillery, and fuel to make their beachhead irreversible. The logic was blunt. Once the invasion force was supplied, it would be protected by battleships offshore, massed artillery ashore, and constant air cover above. In that environment, German armor moving in daylight would be tracked, bombed, and immobilized before it ever reached the front. So Rommel pushed his defenses forward. He ordered more mines, more wire, more stakes, more obstacles in the tidal flats, angled poles and steel hedgehogs meant to rip open landing craft. He pressed infantry divisions to build strong points with interlocking fire. He wanted anti-tank guns, 7.5 centimeters Pak-40s where possible, sighted to hit the exits off the beaches. He wanted machine gun nests set in concrete. He wanted reserves close enough to counterattack immediately. And that last part was where the plan began to fracture. Rommel did not control all the armored reserves in France. Some panzer divisions were held back under a separate chain of command. Hitler insisted on personal authority over key formations, and the German command structure in the West had layers: local corps and divisions, 7th Army in Normandy, Rommel's Army Group B, and above it all, the overall theater command. It wasn't just bureaucracy. It was delay measured in hours, and in Normandy, hours were everything. At 11:38 on June 6, the first urgent request went up the chain: release the armored reserves. The message moved through multiple headquarters, each one trying to determine whether the landings were the main effort or a diversion. Even then, German commanders feared a second landing at Pas-de-Calais, the shorter crossing from England and the one the Allies had spent months implying was the real target. At 12:10, Rommel was still not in his headquarters. His staff had to make decisions without him. Down on the coast, the Germans fought hard in places where their defenses survived the bombardment. Concrete and earthworks protected machine guns. A single MG-42 could fire at a cyclic rate that made open sand feel like a trap. But the Atlantic Wall was not a continuous fortress. It was a thin line, a chain of points and gaps, and the Allies arrived with specialized tools to break it. Some American units brought tanks fitted with dozer blades to push through berms and obstacles. Engineers carried Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives, to clear wire. Naval guns offshore threw heavy shells inland, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. And behind it all came logistics: trucks, ammunition, fuel, radio sets, medical stations, and thousands of men who could keep moving forward because the sea itself was the supply line. Rommel's fear was already becoming reality. At 15:20, the first German armored elements began to move, but they moved cautiously, broken into small groups to avoid air attack. That caution was rational. It was also lethal. A panzer division did not fight as scattered vehicles. It fought as a coordinated mass: tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, engineers, and signals, moving together, striking together. If that mass could not form, it could not hit hard enough to throw the Allies back into the water. By late afternoon, reports from Normandy described a new kind of battlefield: Allied aircraft at low altitude, watching roads and intersections. Drivers hid under trees. Columns halted in orchards. Fuel trucks waited for darkness. A German tank, whether it was a Panzer IV with its 7.5 cm gun or a heavier Panther with its long 7.5 cm KWK-42, was powerful in a direct fight, but it still needed to reach the fight. It still needed a route. It still needed fuel. At 1905, Rommel's staff confirmed that parts of the armored reserve were finally moving toward Normandy. The problem was that moving did not mean arriving, and arriving did not mean attacking. At 21:30, as darkness approached, German commanders attempted localized counterattacks. In some areas they hit hard. In others they met Allied anti-tank guns and naval fire that made open ground impossible. The night hid them from aircraft, but it also hid the enemy. Coordination became slower. Radio discipline mattered. Commanders struggled to identify friendly positions in a landscape now cratered and burning. Rommel returned to France as fast as he could. But speed had a ceiling. There were checkpoints, bombed roads, air patrols, and the unavoidable reality that his headquarters could not physically be everywhere at once. When he arrived back at Roche-Guyon, he found the battle already underway on terms he had warned about for months. Over the next days, the front in Normandy thickened into a grinding, close-range fight. The terrain favored the defense. Hedgerows, sunken lanes, small fields separated by earthen banks and dense vegetation. A machine gun behind a hedge could control a narrow lane. An anti-tank gun could be invisible until it fired. Tanks struggled to elevate their guns over the embankments. Infantry fought at distances where grenades and rifles mattered more than grand maneuvers. This was not the kind of battlefield where Germany could easily conduct a clean, fast counterstroke. At 9:17 on June 10th, Rommel toured forward positions, moving in a staff car, stopping to speak with exhausted infantry officers and artillery commanders. He listened to reports about Allied air attacks, about road movement at night, about units arriving piecemeal. He saw the pattern that haunted him. A defense meant to be decisive in the first hours had become a defensive struggle measured in weeks. Rommel's staff began to frame the problem in operational terms. The Allies were building combat power every day. Their beaches were not just landing sites, they were ports in progress. Thousands of tons of supplies were flowing in. Every day that passed made the invasion less vulnerable to a sudden armored punch. And Rommel also understood something else. Even if the Germans held the line, holding was not winning. Because the Allies did not need to break through immediately. They could apply pressure, expand slowly, and wait for the moment when German reserves were stretched thin. The German army in Normandy had fewer trucks, less fuel, and fewer replacements. The Allies had enough vehicles to keep moving, enough aircraft to make daylight movement dangerous, and enough artillery to punish every German concentration. Rommel had built his plan around preventing exactly that buildup. Now he was watching it happen. By June 14th, the invasion was no longer a question of, can it be stopped? It was becoming a question of, how fast can the Germans adapt to a war of mobility they can't freely conduct in daylight? Rommel's war in the West was turning into a race against time, and time was already on the other side. At 6:40 on June 18, 1944, Rommel stood on a rise south of Bayeux and watched black smoke climb from a road junction that should have been quiet. A German truck column had tried to move at first light. Allied fighter bombers found it within minutes. The strike was quick, rockets, cannon fire, and a second pass to finish what was burning. The ground told the story in fragments. Broken wheels, shredded canvas, and a few men stumbling into ditches to get out of the open. He didn't need a staff map to understand what it meant. Fuel and ammunition did not reach the front in smoke columns. At 8:05, Rommel met with officers from units that had been on the line since D-Day. Their voices were flat. They described a fight measured in meters. A hedgerow line might be 150 meters from the next one, but it could take half a day to cross it. Every field was a compartment. Every lane was an ambush corridor. German infantry squads positioned MG-42s to cut across the gaps, and mortar teams used pre-registered points to drop bombs the moment a field filled with movement. The Americans were learning, too. Small patrols moved first. Engineers followed with wire cutters and satchel charges. Tanks came forward cautiously, keeping their hulls behind the earthen banks. They fired high-explosive shells into hedges before infantry crossed. Radio calls pulled in artillery quickly, 105 mm and 155 mm, because the American system could route fire missions fast when observers could see targets. Rommel's challenge was not simply stopping attacks. It was stopping a method. At 10:12 on June 20th, Rommel sat in a staff briefing as aerial photos were spread on a table. The images showed new Allied dumps near the beaches, rows of vehicles, stacks of crates, tented areas that hadn't existed a week before. The staff marked estimated tonnage and locations. It was the kind of logistical growth Rommel had feared in the first hours, now happening in plain sight. He asked blunt questions. How many bridges had been bombed? How many trucks had been lost? How many replacement engines were available for armored units? His staff had partial answers, but the pattern was clear. Movement in daylight was becoming a calculated risk, and the Germans had no safe alternative route network to replace what air power was destroying. Rommel also had to fight within his own command system. At 14:30 on June 21st, a dispute flared again between the Forward Defense School and the Mobile Reserve School. Some commanders believed armor should be kept back, then thrown into the battle as a concentrated counterattack once the main Allied axis was known. Rommel argued that this was no longer 1940. Concentration was visible from the air. Assembly areas were struck before the attack could start. A panzer division could lose fuel trucks and repair vehicles without ever seeing the enemy. The problem was not theory. It was physics and distance. A Panther weighed roughly 45 tons. It could dominate open ground with its long 75 mm gun and heavy frontal armor, but it needed roads that could carry it, bridges that could bear it, and fuel that could reach it. A Panzer IV was lighter and more reliable, but it was still vulnerable to fighter bombers when forced to move in the open. German half-tracks, artillery tractors, and repair vehicles were even more vulnerable. The armored spear could not move without its shaft. At 9:17 on June 25th, the Allies launched a major attack on the German positions west of Cannes. It was preceded by heavy air bombardment and artillery. Rommel received the reports in sequence, first the sound of aircraft, then the shock of craters, then broken communications. Units reported temporary disorientation. Some positions were wiped out. Others survived and fought, but the psychological effect was real. Men who had endured the Eastern Front still described air bombardment in Normandy as something different, constant, precise enough, and impossible to answer. Rommel's response was practical. He ordered more camouflage, more dispersal. He pushed units to move only at night and to keep vehicles under trees. He tried to build redundant communication paths, field telephone lines buried where possible, radio used sparingly to reduce intercept risk. But he could not camouflage the one thing the front needed most: supply convoys. On July 1st at 7:20, Rommel toured another sector, stopping near a battery position where a crew worked around a worn-out 10.5 cm howitzer. The gun had fired hundreds of rounds. Its crew looked older than their years. They had the will to fight, but their ammunition allotment was tight. When Rommel asked about resupply, the answer came with a shrug and a gesture toward the sky. Meanwhile, the Americans were solving the Bocage. By July 7th, more U.S. units were improvising new tactics. Combined teams with infantry leading, tanks firing into hedgerows, engineers breaching gaps, and artillery walking forward by pre-planned lines. Some American tanks were being fitted with crude steel hedgerow cutters, metal prongs welded to the front that let them punch through earthen banks instead of climbing and exposing their bellies. It wasn't elegant. It was effective. It reduced the seconds a tank spent vulnerable at the crest, where a German gunner with a Panzerfaust or a well-sighted Pak-40 could hit it. Rommel saw the same reports. He understood what adaptation looked like when an army had time, equipment, and mass. At 11:38 on July 10th, he met with senior commanders and listened to the casualty figures and unit strengths. The German infantry divisions were thinning. Battalions that should have had 700 to 800 men were operating at a fraction. Replacement flow was limited. Vehicles were worn down. Fuel allocations were tight enough that training and movement were constrained. The Allied buildup continued. Rommel did what he had always done. He tried to force clarity upward. In mid-July, he drafted and forwarded assessments to higher command, reports that were less about tactics and more about arithmetic. The Allies, he argued, could replace losses and expand their front. Germany could not. He emphasized that Allied air power made maneuver nearly impossible, and that the invasion had become a battle of resources Germany was losing. This was not despair. It was a calculation, delivered by a commander who had built his reputation on clear-eyed operational judgment. At 6 o'clock on July 16th, Rommel's day began before sunrise. He was exhausted, but he kept moving. His staff car traveled the same roads again and again, narrow routes lined with trees and hedges. They were dangerous not only because of enemy aircraft, but because of what the roads represented, a thin, fragile system supporting an army that needed heavy fuel and heavy ammunition. At 1700 hours on July 17th, near the village of Saint Foy de Montgomery, Rommel's car was on the move again. The driver kept speed up, trying to reduce the time exposed on open stretches. The car was a staff vehicle, not armored like a tank, built for mobility, not protection. At 1730, Allied aircraft attacked the road. The strike came fast. A burst of cannon fire stitched the area. The car swerved, left the road, and crashed. The impact threw Rommel hard. He was badly injured, shaken, with serious trauma that removed him from command at the worst possible moment. His absence was not symbolic. He was one of the few German commanders in the West who had been relentlessly focused on the core problem. The Allies had air dominance, and therefore they had the initiative. With Rommel out of action, the German command in Normandy became less coherent under pressure. Decisions slowed. Disagreements hardened. The front did not collapse immediately, but the clock kept ticking. Because the Allies weren't just attacking. They were preparing to break the hedgerow line entirely. By July 20th, German units were still fighting for each village and each field, but the American build-up west of St. Lo was becoming unmistakable. Their artillery parks grew. Ammunition stacks multiplied. More tanks arrived. More trucks. More fuel. The kind of mass Rommel had wanted to prevent on June 6th now existed in depth. And soon, the fight would change from meters to kilometers. At 4 o'clock on July 25, 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army crossed the Seine River. The breakthrough at St. Lo, the result of months of pressure and tactical innovations, had finally been made. Patton's tanks, heavily supported by airstrikes and artillery, surged through the gap like a battering ram through soft wood, tearing into the exposed flanks of the German defenses. For Rommel, this was the moment he had feared. For weeks, the Germans had been trying to hold the Allies on the beaches and in the Bocage, but now the enemy was exploiting the very weaknesses that Rommel's original plan had sought to avoid: long-range maneuver and the rapid buildup of material. Rommel had predicted the breakout. He understood the terrain and knew the Allies would eventually find a way to bypass his forward positions and move into open country. But what he hadn't fully grasped was the pace and ferocity with which Patton could exploit a gap once it appeared. It wasn't just the Allied superiority in numbers. It wasn't just the air dominance or the artillery support. It was the sheer speed at which Patton operated, unpredictable, aggressive, and relentless. At 8:15 on July 25th, Rommel sat in the dim light of his temporary headquarters at Roche-Guyon, poring over reports from his panzer divisions. His fingers traced the path Patton's tanks were cutting through the lines. The distance was staggering. In a single day, the Third Army had moved as far as 50 kilometers, bypassing strongpoints, cutting supply lines, and heading toward the vulnerable rear of the German position. Rommel tried to issue orders to counter the breakthrough, but his options were limited. Most of the armored divisions that could respond had already been battered or were engaged elsewhere. The mobility he had hoped for had been replaced by a nightmare of static defense and piecemeal responses. It was becoming painfully clear to him that he could not react fast enough. By 10:45, Rommel knew he had lost the initiative. The Germans were already retreating to avoid encirclement, their units shattered by Patton's rapid advance. Patton's tanks, supported by fast-moving infantry, artillery, and airstrikes, raced forward without regard for the traditional boundaries of combat. They bypassed pockets of resistance, focusing on cutting off supplies and destroying key infrastructure in their wake. In contrast, Rommel's defensive concept was built on concentrated strength, where every move had to be deliberate and timed precisely to avoid overextending resources. He had designed his forces to respond to direct assaults, not to the kind of fluid, fast-moving warfare Patton was now demonstrating. At 13:30, Rommel received a private report from his senior staff. It was a candid assessment of the situation, prepared without the usual filtering of optimistic reports. The summary was blunt. The Germans were outpaced, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. Patton had achieved the very thing Rommel's plan was supposed to prevent, a breakout that not only pushed the Allies inland, but that threatened to unravel the entire defense of western France. In the coming days, as Patton's Third Army cut deep into the German lines, Rommel's role as commander of Army Group B was becoming increasingly irrelevant. His focus had been on holding fast at the water's edge, but now the fight was being waged in open terrain, and his forces were not prepared to face the speed and overwhelming force of the American advance. At 1800 hours on July 26, Rommel sent a private message to his superiors, acknowledging the situation. His tone was resigned. The message was not one of defeat but of inevitability. The enemy has broken through, and our ability to hold the front is now severely compromised. Immediate and coordinated withdrawal is the only option. He knew that the Allies, with their superior logistical networks and overwhelming air power, could now dictate the tempo of the battle. No amount of defending the beaches could change the fact that the Germans had been outmaneuvered and outpaced by Patton's rapid, relentless assault. As the Germans pulled back, the Americans pushed forward. The terrain that had once favored the defenders now offered no protection to Rommel's battered forces. By August 1, 1944, the Germans had been forced into a full retreat, with Patton's forces continuing their relentless drive toward the heart of France. Rommel's last-ditch efforts to organize a coherent defense fell apart. The once feared German panzer divisions were now scattered, their armor useless against the swarming tide of Allied tanks, infantry, and airstrikes. At 1400 hours on August 3, Rommel finally acknowledged the full scale of the defeat. The Germans had no choice but to withdraw further, leaving behind key positions that had been held for over a month. The collapse was not just strategic. It was psychological. Rommel had gone from being the architect of a carefully planned defense to watching helplessly as the German position disintegrated before his eyes. Patton's breakthrough was not just a military victory. It was a testament to the power of operational flexibility and speed. For Rommel, it was a harsh lesson in the limitations of static defense against an enemy that could adapt faster than his forces could regroup. At 5:30 on July 25, 1944, the breakout began in earnest west of St. Lo. The bombardment that opened Operation Cobra did not sound like the earlier set-piece strikes around Cannes. It was heavier, tighter, and aimed at cracking a narrow seam in the German line. When the dust lifted, the German front, already thin, was torn open in sections. Rommel was not at the map table anymore. He was still recovering from the July 17 air attack and crash that had shattered his body and removed him from the front at the moment the battlefield shifted from hedgerow attrition to operational collapse. The decisions now passed through other hands, field headquarters trying to react while their vehicles hid under trees and their telephone lines were cut by shells. At 9:40 on July 27, German reports described the same pattern over and over. American infantry probing forward, tanks following, artillery saturating any identified gun line, fighter bombers orbiting above road junctions. German anti-tank crews could still kill Shermans. An M4's armor was not built to absorb a close-range 7.5 centimeters hit from a Pak-40, but the Americans were not forcing duels. They were forcing systems failures. They hit communication, fuel, and movement. At 11:05 on July 30th, the German command attempted to stabilize the front with local counterattacks. The results were uneven. In open ground, a Panther could still dominate if it arrived with fuel and infantry support. But those conditions were rare. Tanks arrived alone. Half-tracks arrived without artillery. Artillery arrived without ammunition. When the pieces did assemble, they were spotted and struck from the air. On August 1, 1944, at 12 o'clock, the American Third Army became operational under Lieutenant General George S. Patton. He was 58 years old, hard-eyed, and fully committed to speed. He did not wait for perfect conditions. He demanded movement, and he built a staff rhythm that made hesitation a liability. Radios stayed hot. Road spaces were assigned. Fuel priorities were enforced. Patton's weapon was not a single tank model or a single gun. It was a method, rapid exploitation supported by logistics. At 14:30 on August 2, columns of American vehicles pushed through the gap and into country where the Bocage began to thin. A typical spearhead carried M4 Shermans, M5 Stuart light tanks for reconnaissance, half-tracks packed with infantry, and self-propelled artillery like the M7 Priest, 105 mm guns mounted on tracked chassis that could fire, relocate, and fire again. Engineers followed to clear obstacles and repair bridges. Behind them came fuel trucks and ammunition carriers, targets that mattered more than tanks, because without them the spearhead stopped. The Germans tried to react, but the air made reaction slow. At 9:10 on August 4, a German staff officer attempted to move a reserve battalion in daylight to plug a gap. Within the hour, Allied aircraft struck the road. The battalion broke into smaller groups, hid, and arrived late, if it arrived at all. This wasn't cowardice. It was arithmetic. A truck that burns does not deliver riflemen to a line. By August 7 at 5 o'clock, German commanders launched a desperate counterattack near Mortain, an attempt to cut the American advance and reach the coast. It was an armored thrust under pressure, pushed forward despite air dominance. It ran into American infantry, anti-tank guns, and quick artillery response, with aircraft tearing into movement whenever the clouds lifted. The counterattack stalled, then bled out. At 18:20 on August 10, the German position in Normandy was no longer a coherent front. It was a set of fragments trying to avoid being surrounded. Patton's forces drove toward key crossings and road hubs, aiming to close the trap from the south while other Allied units pressed from the north. This was the moment Rommel had warned about from the beginning. His private admission did not come as a dramatic confession in front of cameras. It came in the form that generals actually use: candid assessments to trusted staff, blunt messages up the chain, and the hard language of operational reality. Rommel had been saying for weeks that the decisive factor was Allied control of the air and the resulting paralysis of German movement. Now, watching the breakout turn into encirclement, that view hardened into inevitability. The tempo was beyond German capacity to match. At 11:45 on August 16, the trap tightened around the German forces near Falaise. Vehicles jammed roads. Horse-drawn wagons mixed with trucks. Tanks tried to push through bottlenecks. Artillery struck the columns. Fighter bombers attacked in daylight. Men abandoned equipment to escape on foot. The German army's most valuable assets, trained crews, experienced NCOs, and operational cohesion, were being shredded faster than factories could replace them. By August 21 at 2000 hours, the pocket was effectively closed, though thousands still escaped in small groups. They left behind destroyed armor, abandoned guns, and wrecked transport. What survived was an army in retreat, not an army capable of restoring a stable defense line. Patton did not stop. He pivoted. At 7:30 on August 25, Paris was liberated by Allied and Free French forces, and Patton's columns continued driving east, pushing through towns and river lines as fast as fuel would allow. The constraint was no longer enemy resistance alone. It was supply. A tank battalion could not run on aggression. It ran on gasoline, spare parts, track links, and ammunition. At 10:03 on September 3, American logistics responded with a system that matched Patton's speed, mass truck convoys feeding the front. The essential fact remained: operational mobility is built behind the fighting edge. Patton's staff understood it. They pushed traffic control, prioritized fuel, and kept the advance moving whenever the supply line could support it. Rommel's story went in a darker direction. On July 20, 1944, 5 days before Cobra, an attempt was made to kill Hitler. Rommel had long argued the war was militarily unwinnable and pushed for political solutions. After the plot failed, suspicion spread through the German High Command. Rommel's name, already prominent, became dangerous. In the autumn, the regime moved against him. At 11 o'clock on October 14, 1944, Rommel was forced to choose between public trial, with reprisals against his family, and suicide. He took poison. The official story announced he died of wounds from the July air attack. The private reality was another casualty of a collapsing state. Patton survived the war in Europe. His final months were filled with occupation duties and friction with politics. On December 9, 1945, he was injured in a car accident in Germany. On December 21, he died from complications. Two commanders, both defined by speed and will, ended in ways that were not shaped by the battlefield they mastered. Their legacy did not end with them. Rommel's Normandy campaign left a clear operational lesson. Air dominance changes ground warfare from the roots up. It punishes concentration, disrupts movement, and makes time the most expensive resource. His insistence on forward defense was not nostalgia. It was an attempt to fight inside the one window where German maneuver could still function. Patton's breakout demonstrated the other side of the equation. Once a modern army breaks into open terrain with radios, fuel, and massed artillery support, speed becomes destructive in itself. It fractures command. It forces retreats before lines are fully formed. It turns a front into a series of fleeing columns. Today, staff colleges still teach the Normandy breakout as a case study in tempo, how logistics, air-ground coordination, and aggressive command can turn a breach into a collapse. Museums display the steel, the MG-42, the PaK-40, the Sherman, the Panther. But the deeper lesson is harder to put behind glass. In Normandy, the plan did not fail because one commander lacked courage. It failed because one side could move, supply, and see faster than the other could adapt.